So we've got this carburetor cleaned off with, I use brake clean. Carburetor cleaner would work as well. They're made very similar materials. Just spray it down. This aluminum should clean up pretty nicely. You can use a little wire brush. If you need to, just something like what you can buy these at Harbor Freight or somewhere. Just a little metal brush. You're just gonna kind of like brushing your teeth. You just get all the gunk off. We have this cleaned, and that's step one before you actually take it apart. You're not gonna be able to get all that out. It doesn't really matter what's in the plastic. It's just for looks. As I mentioned, there's our O-ring still in there. So we have all this cleaned up, nice and good, ready to take apart. For whatever reason, the next thing that you're going to run into probably is these Phillips head screws. Those are what we need to take out to really do the bulk of this work. I don't know why Briggs decided that they wanted to put a Phillips head screw in there and not spend the extra, cent and a quarter to put a hex head in there. But you may have a tough time getting those loose. Just be patient. Don't strip them. Use a penetrating oil like PB Blaster, WD-40, something like that. You can try and soak that in there. I have the best luck actually using a flathead screwdriver because it just seems like there's more twist area when you actually use a flathead that actually fits in there. And what I did was I put it in the vise here. And anytime you're going to put something aluminum and very weak like this in a vise, just be very careful that you're going to put it in where you're not going to pinch any kind of the ports, the fittings. Just make sure you're putting it on the flat. So I put it right there on the square and just snugged it down. You're not trying to tighten anything. You're just going to hold it. So I was able to get them to break free. So I'll go ahead and take these out the rest of the way so we can see what's going on inside of there. You can immediately tell that this fuel is just so bad in here. It smells like paint varnish more than it smells like gas. And that's even when you smell in the tank, like I did the other day when I was pressure washing it, which is something the first kind of thing that you would check when you're going to acquire something like this and say, we haven't had it running for a couple of months since the winter time. It probably runs, but it might need a tune-up. That's going to be your first indication that these people haven't had this thing running at least this season. So the fuel is going to be bad. All right, so we got those two out. All of this is going to come off pretty easily. You're just going to just wiggle it a little bit. All the excess little bit of fuel will come out. And here you have the bowl. This is what they call the bowl, where your fuel solenoid is. And that is just pretty ugly looking. And you can see when I was talking to you about the ethanol fuel. This is what ethanol does to engines. It will turn into, I call it a jelly, because if you actually had fuel in this that was starting to go bad, it actually looks like there's a jelly ball floating around in there. And that can clog up the carburetor inlets and passages just as it floats around and make the engine not run. So that alone will make it, stop running, give you headaches. But then as it sits even longer, that continues to break down and turns into this dust, grit. It's like orange, nasty sand. That all needs to get cleaned out, because even one little piece of that flowing into this main jet area here, which we call the jet, this is where the fuel actually sucks straight through. This is a passage that goes all the way through the carburetor and up into where the actual sucking is going to come through. See that nozzle right there? That is where your fuel's coming through. So as it sits in this bowl, there's just the right size holes drilled in this thing for the jet sizes, and they call them air bleeds, little things, little air vent passages. All that's been microscopically drilled out with tiny drill bits to make sure that this engine is getting just the right amount of fuel sucking into it versus mixing with air to make it run right. And if any of these little gunk balls get clogged in there or get clogged in any of these little passages, the engine's just plain not going to run, because it's like holding a rag over your mouth and expecting you to run a race. It's just not going to happen. So we're going to take our wire brush and some brake clean, carb cleaner, whatever you want. Try and make this thing as clean as a whistle. You certainly want to have it so that there's nothing loose in there. You're probably not going to be able to restore the inside of that to looking like this. I understand that. That's not going to happen because it's chewed into the sides and oxidized it and stuff. But you just don't want to have any loose particles left in here, because as soon as you put this back together, one of those loose particles is going to float in there and you're going to say, I just cleaned the carburetor, why won't it run? So that's going to be the next job. We're going to take the float off, which is going to be a simple job here. This is the float hinge pin, they call it. So sometimes these only come out one way. I can feel it with my hand right now that it does not want to come out this way. We broke it free. We have it here, so it's very lightly in there because it has to pivot on there. So we'll take that, set it aside. Now our float is in here, and the float is actually what controls how much fuel enters the bowl of the engine through this fuel inlet where our rubber fuel holes went in. So when I take this off, you'll be able to see a little better. When this just simply lifts gently off of there, and attached to it is what's called our needle. So I'll show you that in a sec. But this hose inlet here is directly connected to that hole. That's where all of the fuel is entering the engine. So if you have a fuel filter, like I said, that's the only line of defense you have before nasty fuel can go in through that hole. So as this fuel goes in, the needle, they call it, this little metal thing here has a rubber tip on it, because it acts kind of like a plunger, like a stop against that seat. It's a needle and seat, they called it back in the day. So that is what kind of allows the fuel to go in, and it has a slot in here. You can see the head of it, kind of like a T shape, kind of like a golf tee, and it goes into that slot. So you have to make sure it's in that slot when you reassemble this. Now, this being a plastic float, you don't have to worry about setting the float height, which is nice nowadays. Pretty much every float is plastic. So back in the day when they had these made out of metal, these little tangs that were in here, I'll call them, you could actually bend them up and down, and that would affect how much fuel was going in and out of the carburetor, because this thing just kind of rocks up and down as the fuel runs out of this bowl. So as your engine's running, there's just a constant flow of fuel coming in and out, and the float is compensating for that. If the float gets stuck, which can happen, it will get stuck down and flood the engine out with fuel, and it won't run because it can't push past all of that fuel that's just pouring into the engine. It just won't run right. So sometimes, luckily this hinge pin was pretty clean. If you get one that's really bad, the hinge pin will actually get stuck and the float won't pivot. It won't swing on that. So you have to take that out of there and sand it down with some sandpaper or some steel wool, get it back to being this nice, clean, shiny looking. So that way this can pivot on there. The only other issue that you may have someday is if the needle wears out, this little rubber tip, the ethanol fuel can really get in there and do, mayhem to them, because ethanol does not like soft rubber things, which is exactly what this is made out of. So if you have an issue where, let's say you park the tractor, you can come back the next day and it either won't run or there's fuel leaking out of it, this could be the culprit, because the rubber is not seating in anymore. It's just too hard to actually make a seal. So you may have to take this apart, put a new needle and seat in there, and that should take care of your fuel leak problem, because most engines don't have a fuel shut-off anymore. So sometimes back in the day you had a fuel shut-off valve, an actual inline valve, kind of like that fuel filter that we had, and you could turn it just like you were turning off your hose at home, and it would stop the fuel from the flowing into the engine. That way, if you stored it, you could store it dry so that the fuel wouldn't go bad. But you can always add those in. That way you can run the engine out of fuel to have less likelihood of the fuel going bad in the carburetor. So we'll get this cleaned out. What we're going to do is take some compressed air, which I won't video, but you're going to want to take compressed air either if you have a can of that compressed air. If you don't have an air compressor, you're going to want to blow it into every one of these little passages, because air in some fashion goes through all of those. And if air isn't flowing correctly through them, it's not going to allow the engine to run right. Your primary one that you have to watch is blow it in this main jet here. Blow the air through, and if it feels clogged, you should be able to see air vapor, or just the air come through that metal tube there. You have to get that clean in order for the engine to run right. The other ones here are these other holes in the mouth of this carburetor, or the throat as we would call it. These holes here, they allow air to equalize through. They're all usually connected to these. So some of them are connected just to allow the bowl to vent, so that way it doesn't get like locked up with air, so that way it has the same atmospheric conditions. So just take air, blow them through there. You don't have to be crazy. You don't have to put 100 pounds of pressure in there. I mean, it's really just going to be a little bit more than your breath blowing through there, just to get it cleared out. Spray some brake clean through there. You'll be amazed. Sometimes some little pieces come out of there, and that could be the culprit if your engine isn't running right. So we're going to do that. We're going to get this thing cleaned out and put back on and roll the dice and hope for the best. One thing that you're probably never going to see on an engine, this 2005 may have been one of the last years for it. This is actually a air and fuel mixture screw. The EPA did away with these because they're trying to get super green with emissions, and it actually kind of backfires a little bit, because a lot of times the engines won't run right once they get some time on them. Things get worn in. These jet sizes, which is what allows the right amount of fuel to flow through, will change and get kind of clogged up. So they put this mixture screw in. You could turn it to allow the sizes of those to basically change on the fly. So when the motor was running, if it was surging or if it stumbled or anything like that, you could just kind of turn this and that would fix it. Back in the really olden days, probably over 15 years ago, these were fully adjustable. So they had one on the bottom for the high speed and one on the top for the idle, or vice versa, that you could really dial the engine in to make it run right. But with the emissions and stuff, they tried to get rid of that so that these little single cylinder engines were putting out less emissions. So now this one here, you'll see it has like a stop on it, so you can only turn it so much. I mean, that could easily be modified if you had to, but if this engine's running right, you should not need to move it more than that. So it really only turns about a half a turn before it gets to the stop. So chances are we're not going to have to play with that, but when we get down to fine tuning this thing, if it starts to kind of hunt a little bit, surge a little bit, we can play with that just a hair and see if we can get it to run nice and smooth. So I'm going to blow this thing out and we'll start putting it back on.